Okay, so I did want to say, and if you're in the US, you may already know this, but May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And that was one of the reasons why we wanted to do this particular presentation for you during the month of May. Now, I realize internationally, different countries have different days, but May is Mental Health Awareness Month, and we're hoping that this helps contribute to the awareness. And the other announcement that I wanted to make is just to let you know that what we're going to focus today is more about working with grief and trauma in the consulting room, and not really about finding grief and trauma in astrology charts. So just so you know, if you're waiting and wondering when we're going to pull up a chart and say, you know, Saturn conjunct the moon is, you know, grief or depression, we're not going to be doing that today. So I just wanted to set that stage so that you have a good expectation of what we're going to talk about. So my first question that I'm going to put out to the two of you is, tell us about your practice. What does your practice look like? Because I know that both of you focus on these topics in your practice. So just know what that looks like. Who wants to start? Maybe Alicia, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start. So I'm a counselor, which is a bit different. I'm not a psychologist or a psychotherapist. My practice looks like, I've got both astrology clients and counseling clients. I use astrology in my counseling, and I use my counseling techniques in my astrology as well. And, this is part of it. I really believe that clients come to me for this special, unique blend of the way that I work. People often come to me, and I find astrologers in general in a chance of going, I've got a big life choice to make, or I'm having a real struggle here with something in my life, and I need some insight and guidance. So I remember when I first studied astrology, I immediately, as soon as I finished, scuttled off and did my counseling degree, because I was just like, I don't have enough here to just be with clients. Now, that's not definitely what everybody has to do, but with stellium in Scorpio, that was what I needed to do. So, yeah.
And would you say
What about
that
you?
I'm going to ask you this question, and then Kestrel, if you would also answer this question. In your practice, because your background is in counseling, do you find that you do multi-sessions most of the time, or do you find that you do single sessions?
It's a blend of both, but I would say most of my practice is people coming and seeing me repeatedly for both astrology consultations, but also, I have my weekly, fortnightly counseling clients as well.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so Kestrel, tell us about your practice.
Yeah, so I have a practice that incorporates both as well. I would say the majority of my week is spent with counseling clients. So I'm a licensed professional counselor here in the US. And yeah, I see probably about 20 clients a week. And what I've also discovered, I do quite a few astrology consultations during the week as well. But oftentimes people will come to me through astrology, knowing that I have a counseling background, and oftentimes in the discovery of the chart, or coming in contact with some sort of grief or trauma, a lot of times people will then decide they want to go on and do more in-depth counseling with me. And I think part of the reason people are interested in my work is I have a huge grief history of my own. I lost a first love in 2009, and I'm really involved with the Climbing Grief Fund, which is through the American Alpine Club here in the US. And so I have a lot of dedication to that work. I feel like I've had a tremendous apprenticeship of my own in grief and sorrow, and also do a ton of work with Francis Weller. I don't know if some of the audience is familiar with his work, but he's a depth psychologist and marriage and family therapist who does a lot of work evolving the conversation around grief. So I think that's where I find the most interest. And I have a very Mercury driven chart. So I really consider myself a psychopomp and somebody who is a guide between all these liminal spaces.
Yeah, yeah. There is, for me, a mix as well, just to share. And I just want to clarify that I no longer provide the psychological services. You know, I'm not doing counseling, and it's twofold. One is because my license doesn't allow me to practice where I live. And the second is because I've moved to a different focus with my work. And so I find that I'm working more with people who want the counseling part, but not the therapy part. And I know we're going to talk about that difference. And I think that's really key, and that most astrologers are doing some sort of counseling, but not therapy. And so for me, it's kind of like it's someone without a diagnosis who's functional, but wants something more. And I think all astrologers are, you know, working with someone in that capacity, but only a particular branch of astrologers will be able to do the therapy parts. So I'm wondering, when you think about your practice and what you're doing, like how much of it is what you would consider you would need a license or some sort of professional certification to do that, versus I could do this if I didn't have my credentials? Does my question make sense? You know, like I would love to hear from you, like how do you see your clientele? Does it fall mostly in the diagnosis therapy side, or is it more in the consulting counseling side?
I can't diagnose. I'm not allowed to, and which is actually very freeing for me, because the therapy styles that I use are not about diagnosis. They're more about meeting the client where they are. Look, I would say 70% of my practice is around working therapeutically with clients rather than astrologically. In an astrology session, yeah, it really depends on the client, their needs, where they're at, as to how many therapeutic tools that I am specifically trained in that I would be using. You know, if a client's showing up wanting to know about fertility or medical astrology, then I might not go there at all. But if a client's showing up talking about, you know, divorce that they're going through, or, you know, a really challenging event in childhood that has shaped where they are right now and it feels like it's blocking them, then absolutely that would be where, you know, I have a background I'm a trauma counselor. I have a background in addictions as well. I used to work in addiction treatment centers. So for me, that's, you know, I tend to get clients showing up wanting to explore that kind of stuff. And I can see, you know, it's a big belief of mine that so many of us are dealing with some level of trauma in our lives, and we get frozen in the past with that. So this is where I think astrology can help us unlock that to, you know, help people heal, integrate, and move forward. What about you, Kestrel?
Yeah, I would say probably 70% of my practice is therapeutic as
Mm.
well. I'm in an interesting position. I would love to not, well, actually, I'd be clear about this. I do take insurance, and I think I want to give a lot of access to my services, but then that puts me in a medical model. And as a licensed professional counselor in the US, you can diagnose, and maybe that's some of the discernment. I know this was a question that was going to come a little later, but I do diagnose, I do assess, and I do work with those with more major mental health diagnosis. I have to say, in general, I try to diagnose on the lighter end of thing, just enough so people can use their insurance, because I really believe that people should have access to therapy. But then this is where it gets interesting. I also have a coaching waiver, so I can see people out of state. So a lot of people who come to me through the astrology, they end up joining in more under a coaching waiver, where it's more of a counseling style, where I have a lot more liberty to be creative and to bring in the astrology as well. And that's where it gets really interesting for me. And I'm still have all the evidence-based practices behind me as well, but I'm using a little bit more discernment.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk a bit about grief and how you define grief, and how that looks in a session.
Let me
So,
throw up a slide that may help here, and just pause and let everybody have a quick read. I mean, this is actually, Kestrel, I'll let you speak to this, lovely, because grief is your focus and most of these are your definitions.
Yeah. I'll let people just kind of glance for a second. And then also really acknowledge, like I said at the beginning, I really believe in making the experience of grief really inclusive. It's not something that needs to be fixed or something that we're necessarily looking for a solution. And I really love thinking about grief in terms of the astrological realm, because it really is not a linear process. And I think when I look at astrology, I'm thinking about the study of time and cycles, and I think it can be really cyclical. I don't necessarily fall under the Kubler-Ross thinking of grief. Some of you may be familiar with that, stages of grief. I think that it's much more phases of emotions and intensity of emotions that can look a certain way at one time, transmute, and become something else. I really also like looking at the metaphor of, if you have a calm lake, I think of grief as the pebble that falls into a glass off lake and then creates ripples very, very close together. And as time goes on, those ripples get further and further apart, but you're always bumping into the grief. It's infinite, but there may be periods of calmness. There may be periods of other emotions coming on board, including joy, and they can both coexist. And yeah, I'll just say that to start, and then see if others want to ping pong, and we can keep just building on the breadth and depth of grief that people experience. There's no textbook way to experience grief. It's very unique for everyone. And sometimes we don't externally see people grieving, but that doesn't mean that under still waters, there isn't great emotion or processing going on.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I trained with Kubler-Ross's grief, and I know that they've shifted that, and David Kessler as well has added a 6th stage, and I do see that those are there and in this, anger, bargaining, acceptance, denial, all those things. But I agree with you, Kestrel, and Kestrel introduced me actually to his name's Francis Weller. And I was just listening to a podcast with him the other day that I loved, which is, he says you think about it as you're walking in companionship with grief in one hand and gratitude or joy in the other. And I think it's a really important thing to be aware of, that grief it's just part of life. It's part of being a human here on the planet, knowing that you've loved something and that inherently we're going to lose it. When we lose it and how we lose it, it will change. And I think when people connect to this as part of human experience, it really helps them understand this, helps them see that, there's an intelligence inside of grief and sorrow, and it's not about completely taking us over. I know, people often feel, I don't want to deal with my grief because it's going to overwhelm me and I'll never get out of bed. But actually, when we welcome it in as a friend, as a companion, it can be really special to see, why do we feel sorrow? Imagine if we didn't feel grief. What would that mean for love? And I think in many times it's almost that yearning to come back and belong to something. So yeah, that's a lot of where I kind of go with grief and what I talk to about it. And I myself have a personal experience. My father passed away last year after 4 years of living with dementia, and I use a water analogy as well, where it's like the ocean. You may have a storm come in, and that's the initial phase of it, and the waves are huge and you just feel like you're going to be swallowed up, and sometimes you do go under with it. but you always bob up the other side, and eventually the waves get further apart and the swell reduces, and there may be another storm that bumps in close, a reminder or an anniversary, but every time, it's that reminder that actually it's because I lost that person that I'm feeling this, and I acted in the first place. What about you, Laurie?
Well, how I define grief, I don't have a good metaphor. I love both of your metaphors. And I have to say, I did not work clinically with grief. And I think as I'm listening to you talk, what keeps coming up for me is how difficult it can be to want to support someone. Like I'm actually going through, a friend of mine is chronically ill. I mean, he's in hospice. He's not going to make it, and he's 6 years younger than me. So, there's this thinking like, oh, this person who I've known for a long time just isn't even going to make it to the age that I'm living. And then what comes is that loss of like, what do you say? Like, the words aren't there. What are the right words to say? And sometimes I'm just speechless. And so I think that, that's kind of the core of the question of, and hopefully I think that the listeners are probably wondering this as well, is that the person experiencing the grief, it hurts, right? We see the pain, we want to make it better. And this person walks into our counseling room and discloses that they've experienced grief, whether it was recently or not, but it's there. And what do you do when that happens? Like, how do you help someone? How do you help them walk through that? And me having a friend, and it's a couple, so one friend is going to live and survive, and one friend is going to pass away, and the one who's going to survive is having a completely different experience, right? So that's the core of this discussion. Like, what can I say, and what are the right words? And they even did a podcast recently, saying like, everyone says they're sorry, but that doesn't help. So, I'd love to, and like I said, I was a psychotherapist for many years. I did not do grief counseling. So I don't have a wealth of grief counseling experience to draw on, just more of my own. You both shared personal experiences. I'd really like to hear how you, on the professional side, when you're working with somebody who's expressed that they've had grief, or they're going through some sort of grief experience, what do you do? And is there a wrong thing to say? Is there a right thing to say?
You're me, lady.
You go first, lovely.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing for me is just really acknowledging and slowing down and welcoming everything about the experience. And I think that it can be really hard to do, because we have to check in with ourselves as well, our comfort levels around that. I mean, it can be really triggering, and there can be a lot of fear around, or concern about, saying the wrong thing. I think it's very important to not placate. I think it can be really dismissive and reductionist to say everything's going to be okay, everything happens for a reason. Some people may find that useful, but I think in general, letting people know you're there, deep listening. I'm trying to think of a phrase, I'm here for you, and I see that you're in a lot of pain. Not the, I know how you feel. I think it's important to come alongside people and companion. That's something Alicia was saying, befriending grief and being a companion to the grief, but making it permissive for it not to be okay. I'm a big fan of this book by Megan Devine, It's Okay to Not Be Okay. And checking ourselves, right? As consultants or even as friends to people, are we uncomfortable? Are we trying to rush the experience? And I think it's okay for people to be in the space as long as possible. I know there can be a lot of overwhelm and there's worry for us concerned about others that they won't come out the other side. But I think when people feel held and have permission to feel it all and welcome it all, this also comes into internal family systems. I can't help going there. So I'll leave it there for the first part of the answer and let others fill in.
Yeah, it's beautiful what you're saying, Kestrel. And Laurie, I just wanted to say my heart goes out to you, lovely, you know, and I'm here if you need me. That's a hard experience to be going through. And I think, look, I want to caveat this first by saying as well, everything that Kestrel and I and Laurie will be sharing today is what we do in our astrological practices, not what we do in our counseling and coaching practices. You know, I'll give an example of a story. I had a client come to me and she didn't share anything about loss. You know, she was actually talking about work and relationships. And I touched on something about family, you know, looking at the IC and her chart. And she, you know, she'd had a heavy transit though with her IC ruler. And she just started sobbing. And it turned out that her father had died 2 weeks before, and her father was her world. And, you know, it's really, it's tempting to go in there and you know, as Kestrel said, to placate, to pat her on the back and, you know, try to move things on. But all I did was go, oh, that's really hard. I can see your heart break, and just sat. And I had to, you know, I had tears rolling down my cheeks as well because of what had happened recently for me. And that was okay too. And the thing to know is that these emotions usually only last 2 to 3 minutes. You know, these big waves come up and out the other side. And for us as consultants, we may be sitting there going, oh my God, this is never going to end. But it does, as yours does, your clients will as well. And so sometimes it's just going, I'm here. I'm holding space for you. And if you've got a box of tissues nearby, you can kind of push it closer. Don't give it to them because it can interrupt the process as well. But it's just knowing that if you can hold space for a big wave, it just makes such a difference for somebody to feel held and not to interfere, not to dive in, not to try to bring information. And sometimes some of the right things to say are, how can I help you? You know, what do you need? Put the ball in their court, which gives them, which empowers them and gives them dignity to be able to ask for what they need, even in the astrological session. And if it's just with friends, it's the same thing, you know, it's showing up. I was reading something about grief where, you know, food is love in grief, you know, so that literal turning up with casseroles or food can also be something that you help someone with. And yeah, I find grief can be like a bubble at times, very isolating. Just standing on the outside of that bubble, letting the person know that you're there whenever bubble bursts or they're willing to reach through can also be helpful too.
Mhm. Yeah, my background is trauma, like I said, more than grief, but maybe a similar way that I would handle someone with grief as with trauma is to just be really aware of what they're saying, whether it's verbally or nonverbal, to, you know, take the cue and to not feel like I have to fix it. Because I think that, you know, as an astrologer or a therapist, when someone's coming to you, there's this pressure that we're giving them some answers. And yes, astrology has lots of answers, but an answer to grief, you know, there's not really an answer. It's a feeling, and it's something that you go through. And encouraging the person to feel their grief, or not encouraging them to feel it, but to, you know, support that we have to feel our way through it. We can't avoid it. We can't go around it. You know, you can try, but it's still there. And right. So, but I've always found that when I'm in that situation and it's that really uncomfortable, like, this is a horrible feeling, this is a, you know, this is a thing that's happening that we don't want to happen, but to just be with that person and and you mentioned this before, to be with them where they are. And I know we're going to talk more about that today, but I think that's really an important theme. It's something that we're going to keep coming back to, is that we really have to meet our clients where they are.
Yeah, it's a good point, Laurie. And I think one last thing I'd say as well is not to have expectations of where people should be, especially so in grief, that would look like not expecting to move them through it or move them past it. It's letting them be where they are right in that minute and naming it. You're incredibly sad, and that's totally normal for this situation.
Yeah. So here's a question that is related to today's modern world. Before, the concept of meeting with the client on a computer was so foreign, right? And now it's kind of the opposite. More often than not, at least for me personally, I'm meeting people online. So is there a difference if someone were to express or disclose that they're experiencing grief, they're crying, you can't move a tissue box closer to them in that moment? Is there anything different or any nuances that you've noticed with online counseling versus face-to-face?
I work mostly online, even in my counseling practice. And well, even actually, no, I can't, like, move a tissue box closer. I would never touch a client without them asking for a hug first. That's part of my practice anyway. So that's out of the realm anyway. And no, sometimes there's things that just pass, there's energy that just passes. And so I energetically just make sure I'm trying to hold space for the client and letting them know, verbally, I'm here for you. I may work a bit harder verbally for them, but yeah, generally not for me. What about you, Kestrel?
Sometimes come in a little closer. I'll ask permission too. Sometimes I have the tissue box on the side. I've also just noticed, I think people sometimes can be more vulnerable on the other side of the screen. I think it depends on the person, but I have noticed a great deal of comfort and safety when we're doing a consultation with somebody in their home. And also giving permission. It's okay to get up if you need to get tissue or take a break or slow this down. And then, yeah, the verbal affirmation that I'm still there with them.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about trauma, our other part of the topic today. And here we are. We're going to have a slide on trauma, I'm guessing. Yes. So do one of you want to talk about, or one of you want to start on how you would define trauma?
Well, one of the tricky things about trauma is there really is there's some consensus around it. And even with the DSM, the Diagnostic Services Manual, it doesn't really define trauma. It kind of talks about what to do with trauma, but it doesn't really define it. So we've pulled together these definitions. So we'll just let people have a moment to kind of read through them. These are all known experts in the field of trauma right now. And hopefully, if you've read through them all, you'll get the sense that really trauma is about right now. The effects that are happening in your life right now to an experience that happened to you previously. And there's the 3 E's of trauma, as it's called. There's the event that happens. There's your experience of the event, which may be totally different to other people's experience of the event due to different factors. And then there's the effects. And this is where we deal with in trauma of, okay, how are you in this present moment responding, reacting to what happened to you in the past? And there's all these different ways to deal with trauma clinically, but we're not talking about that today. We're talking about what to do when you are an astrologer and people are talking about trauma. Oh, you're even noticing trauma in the room. I think it's really important to be aware. I love Beaumarchais quote here, trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happened to you. Oprah Winfrey's got a brilliant book called What Happened to You, I think. And I think this is very much at us as astrologers, one of the best things that we can do when it comes to trauma is get curious with the client about it. And I think this is something astrologers do naturally anyway. And we don't necessarily name it as trauma as astrologers. You can kind of think, oh, that sounded traumatic for you, or what you're talking about may have may have caused trauma in you. We have to be careful as astrologers not to be diagnosing and labeling clients. It's really important there. But yeah, I think it's if we can look at, right, these are the present effects of what's going on, and then help clients find ways forward from there. Because it's something that happens within our system. It's literally something within our central nervous system, something within our body, different to grief. This is a whole system response to a threat that has happened in the past, an adverse experience, and that our body keeps informing us there's a threat there, so that it can induce that whole fight, flight, freeze, that autonomic response that happens, and we can be naming that for clients and suggesting different tools or different techniques or different therapists that they could go to support them moving through trauma as well. Yeah, Kestrel, what would you add to that, lovely?
Well, I just want to amplify just how exquisite our nervous system is. We're designed for this. And that's intense to say because we're all designed for grief as well. And it's something that we'll all experience to some extent, and the nervous system wants to return to harmony. So I think that's part of it. Even when you're in a consultation and somebody starts to show more extreme emotions, or sometimes I will label it hot or cold symptoms, and you don't need to explain this to your clients, but you can just notice, am I seeing more anxiousness or more tearfulness, or am I seeing more of a numbing or a depression? Or I don't even want to necessarily call it depression, but a sadness coming up. I think that's just something we can attune to in our consultations, to notice that the nervous system is taking care of itself. I mean, tears can be a great release. It can be very healing to be witnessed in our tears and not alone. Not that doing it alone isn't helpful, but I do think there's something communal. And as we're talking about this too, I guess it makes me curious to ask people, why astrology? Why now? Because I think there's some hope that clients can let us know why they're coming. Why is it that they're being witnessed in a different way? And then in addition to the trauma, I think it's just important for us all to be a little bit more trauma sensitive or trauma informed. You don't have to know all the ins and outs, but probably every person who's coming to us has experienced some adverse childhood experience. Whether it's a big T trauma, like a major catastrophic event, or a smaller T trauma, just over time, small things, neglect over time can really lead to a trauma response as well. So
yeah, I was part of a trauma-informed care team, and we did the questionnaire. I don't remember the name of the exact name of it, but there was 10,
The
15
ACEs,
questions.
the ACEs probably.
Yes.
adverse childhood experiences.
That was exactly it. So we had maybe 20, 25 of our staff do this together as part of our training. And it was 80%, maybe higher than that, of our staff who had experienced a significant number of them. There were very few people who had the low number and it's like, different types of adverse childhood experiences. It was amazing to see how many people had experienced multiple different types of trauma. So it is prevalent, I think, in our society, and we don't always know if someone is being activated during the conversation, right? So if someone walks in the door, we're having a consultation, we don't always know if the conversation is going to activate something. I think we all agreed that we were using the term trauma activation just to give it words so that we all knew what we were talking about. And so do you want to share any more about, how do you know if a trauma has been activated, and, what do you do with that? When someone's becoming more upset about the conversation and it's a trauma activation?
I think, talking about the autonomic nervous system, Kestrel just talked to it beautifully. People may start to display anxious feelings. They may be shaking. They may go really flat or dissociate. That's another trauma activation as well. So the kind of the fight, flight, freeze is generally where I see how trauma is activated. And I generally, even in an astrology consult, I will name it, not as, hey, and just to say, we're using the word activated rather than triggered, because triggered has very different connotations, especially, for those of you in the US, guns is a huge thing that many people are exposed to. So it's something that we tend to move away from the trauma conversation now. It's when a client is activated in trauma, it's really important to pause and stop and name it. Say, hey, I see you're feeling sad, or I noticed that, this is, you're shaking, or, are you okay? Do you want to keep exploring this topic? Do you want to move on to something else? Where do you want to go from here? I really find it's really important, because one of the big things about trauma is the sense of powerlessness or helplessness in the situation that contributes to trauma being an ongoing effect. So I try to give power back to the client as much as possible so that they feel like you can move out of it. If I wasn't trained in trauma, I would be definitely talking about resources or people that they could go to, making sure you've got a good resources or referrals list of people. That may not necessarily be specific people, depending on, if you have a client who's local, then you might know someone locally you could refer them to. But if not, then you might just say, hey, this is a type of therapy that works really well. For example, EMDR or polyvagal theory, and this is on to you as the astrologer to kind of get to know this, get to understand this. Big no-no is looking at a chart and going, hey, see that this could have contributed to your trauma, or this might be what it's about. Why, further digging in that circumstance, I would say, if a person's fine with their story and just talking about it, then they may have done a lot of work of healing it. But if they're actively showing that they're activated, you don't want to re-trigger them. So, cautiously stepping backwards, giving them the, Kestrel, what else would you add to that?
Yeah, I think it's beautiful what you said. I think the importance of slowing things down and not overwhelming the client more with more information, and that resourcing. Are you okay? What do you want? What do you need? And just helping their nervous system oscillate back and forth. Like I said, we have these exquisite nervous systems that are actually designed to do that. So people will often follow us, if they need to back away from that. And also really trusting their agency and autonomy of what's helpful for them, or what they've been trying, or pulling on some of their own expertise.
And that's a really good point, actually, because I just saw someone say in the chat that the traumatized often help, those who have been traumatized help those in trauma. And that's actually where we have to be really careful ourselves to stay as neutral and as calm in that space as possible too, because we may be activated, and I guess we'll talk to it later on, but I'd make a point here, if you are someone who does have a trauma yourself or trauma in your history and you're working with clients in trauma, it's really important that you get tools now so that you can lean onto or lean in, both in your personal life, but also within the therapy room at time as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry,
And
not the consulting room. Sorry, not the therapy room.
May I add something? I just wanted to say too, like, I know we're not looking at the specifics of the chart, but I think it's okay if clients in particular are really familiar with their charts and they're making meaning from their charts, we can honor that. I've done some existential detective work with my chart in specific, and there are certain things and timings that have happened that were very validating to see that kind of helped me understand what was going on during that time. And I even think the language of grief, for example, comes from grave or gravitas. It can really speak to that Saturn work, and how can we hold that archetype where we're really vesseling and holding a container of safety for our clients, where they have permission to emote in a non-judgmental environment.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would just like to add that it is important to recognize how the client is experiencing what they're sharing with you. And like, I think it was Alicia who was saying that some of the clients will have done work on their trauma and have no problem stating what happened to them, but it can be shocking to the astrologer, right? If somebody says, this happened to me, and you hear this and it's like, oh, like that's scary, like a scary thing that has, now my responsibility is to recognize where they are and not to assume that they're activated in trauma by saying it, and to be really clear with what they're asking of me, that maybe there was a reason that they shared that story with me, but they're there for career advice. And it was just happened to mention this statement, but it wasn't an activation. So just kind of looking at the other side, that sometimes or often we're going to hear things and we have to be able to see where the client is coming from and stay with them. And if it seems like they've mentioned something that we would label as a trauma activation, but they're not really presenting as if they're feeling activated, that, we may want to say, hey, you mentioned that, and I just want to make sure you're okay. But if they are, that we have to kind of pull ourselves back into the focus that the clients asked us to do, what they've paid us to do, what they've showed up, to get help for. This is, I think, that consulting skill that's really important for astrologers to have, so that we are better prepared to move through that client session in the way that's going to best help them. But going back to when they are actually activated, and there's that determination, like, how much help can I give them and how much help do they need? So there's going to be times where they might need a referral, and there may be times where it was that wave and it passed over, and by the end of the session they seem okay. So I'd love to hear from both of you on how you work with a referral process, if you felt like you needed to refer, and also some advice for our listeners who may not be clinicians, may not be able to go further. So just some advice for referrals.
I think that this comes with getting more and more, and please excuse my children in the background if you can hear that noise. It's as your practice grows and as you have more and more experience, your referral list will build as well, because suddenly you'll have a client who comes in and you're like, oh gosh, I didn't think about that as a possible referral. But I think in general, it's really good to have an understanding, especially in these kind of tough conversations, of the styles of therapy. There's different articles out there. Actually, I wrote one for Wellbeing magazine a while ago that you can get online, thinking about a person's moon sign as to what style of therapy, which element would work for what style of therapy. I think knowing as well different other healing modalities too that may be helpful for clients, even different theories. This one, it's in our resources, but polyvagal theory is excellent for trauma, even just informing clients to go and have a look up. Deb Dana and Stephen Porges. There's loads on YouTube about it. There's actually a really good video by I think it's the American Trauma Association. It kind of talks through what polyvagal theory is and just helping calm the nervous system. And these might be things that you can pick up in a person's chart. If they have a Mercury-Uranus conjunction or different things happening in their chart, then you may see trauma being activated or things being activated. And Kestrel, you did make a really good point. I think what I was saying about digging into trauma is when that person's activated. So I think it's really amazing to be able to reflect to clients, hey, I can, around that time, did something really hard and challenging happen to you? And what was that like? And how can we set goals to help you through it? But I think if a client's activated, you don't want to be digging there in that time too. But coming back to referrals, just look in your local area, get to know people online as well. If you tend to deal with clients internationally, I just tend to know, right, if I'm going to refer clients, I may refer them for somatic therapy, I may refer them for Hakomi therapy, I may refer them for EMDR or different things. But we as astrologers need to have broad range in many things. I'm sure people find with their practices that this is the way. So you may have referrals for financial goals and ways to set it, and just thinking about the therapeutic model as well, as to, okay, if a client is turning up and I'm having tough conversations, where would I move them to? What books, what other resources? And we've got a slide coming up with all of that to help you. But yeah, Kestrel, what would you add?
I just think it's really important to network. I think that's kind of why you and I've come together, Alicia. Is I got really curious because I was a practicing clinician, and then I was starting to wonder who were the astrologers out there also practicing therapy or counseling. And all your points are great, Alicia, just like networking in your local communities. And in the US, we have Psychology Today, which is a great way to find therapists. And therapists are usually willing, or at least I am, I've noticed in my community, to do a 10 to 15-minute consultation to see if it's even a good fit and what the client's looking for is something we can accommodate. And also I've discovered a lot of people are coming into the astrological consult already having therapists. So I'd be curious if other people are discovering that and people are looking for something else out of the astrology consult, which I think we might touch on a little bit as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we've said a few times, I think all of us have said it in different ways, and we've said it explicitly, that we want to meet our clients where they are at. And I mean, this is a term that goes way back for me, even when I was first in school studying to become I'm actually a marriage and family therapist. That's my license. So I think it's very applicable in astrology as it is in psychotherapy. And so I thought, we'd just start with talking a little bit, each of us, about, what does that mean? And then, I'll just turn it over and let each of you speak to that.
I guess I can go to start. Well, I do like asking the question, why astrology? Why now? I think it's a great way to get an understanding of what would be helpful. What's the consultation about, what are their best hopes and wishes for the encounter, really slowing down and making sure. I think it's interesting with the astrology consultation because, we spend often quite a bit of time with folks' charts before we even meet the person. And it's easy to start projecting or seeing things and wondering and being curious about what you're seeing, but really staying true to what people want and really meeting people in a non-judgmental way, really witnessing, really listening. And like I was saying, really being able to hold that protective container and vessel. I'm feeling repetitive all of a sudden. There's some like dovetailing with some of the topics.
Do you
Well, I
want to
think the
add?
only other thing I'd add to that is just acceptance. I'm trained in person-centered counseling or Rogerian counseling, and acceptance is a big part of that. Just helping people accept where they're at, me accepting where they're at, and just saying, here is where you are right now. There's something about being in the present moment. Jupiter and Taurus, I think, is going to help us all get there a lot. But there's something about being where you're at, whether you're feeling triggered by trauma or activated by trauma, whether you're feeling, overwhelmed or, in deep sorrow with grief. It's okay. As Kestrel was saying earlier, it's okay to not be okay. And I think that's one of the things about the current culture is, so much of it's expected to be happy and optimistic and upbeat and, heading somewhere in life, going after things. And that's so yang. And it's like, okay, there are points and times in our lives where we will be in the yin of things as well. And, where we're falling into a corner and licking our wounds. And that is important and will help us be in the yang moments as well, in a lot more grounded way. So I think that's what I would be saying is talking to clients definitely in that way of like, it's fine. And I know accepting that for me, the big work, that's self-work too.
And I just feel like the practice of astrology so invites not just the daytime consciousness, it also invites the nighttime consciousness. And, we have teams in astrology as well, the Jupiter and Saturn versus Venus and the moon and Mars. But I also think everybody has Pluto in their chart and Saturn somewhere, and it really invites that underworld journey. And when we look at retrogrades too, I think it really acknowledges a creative way of thinking about grief and trauma. And I think when we can think mythologically and cosmologically, it also offers something beyond just the narrative or origin stories.
Beautifully put, Kestrel.
Thank you. I'm super into that because I think if you can find your place in a story, and we have this whole Greek pantheon, if you bring that into your practice, it can give guidance and it can give reassurance, and Mercury or Hermes shows up a lot as a guide in a lot of those stories. Or Hecate, she honors those threshold moments, those crossroad moments. And I think there's just something really beautiful and lovely about that. That it can be liminal. It's okay to be in the in-between.
Because I think that's the gift of myth, isn't it? It's that collective human experience that went on for thousands and thousands of years, those stories that are pulled from that place. And it helps us feel a part of something and belonging to something. I think the Greek tragedies is another thing to look at, as this is just life and we are human and it's okay to be here. Kestrel, I know because you're Jungian, you have that Jungian background. You speak to mythology a lot, don't you? I always love, Kestrel's always teaching me amazing things about about myths and astrology. So I think that's one of the beauties of bringing myth in as an analogy or a story with clients too. So that would definitely be a suggestion, is get to know your myths. I mean, I've always loved them I'm teaching my daughter some of them anyway, but yeah, Kestrel has a unique, that Jungian kind of juice with it.
Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a
and
way to, it's just going to say it's a way to examine a story with someone without personalizing it to them.
Yeah. And it's fun to reimagine the myths too and be playful with them and let people make their own meaning from them.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. The Medusa myth. And I work with a lot of that fixed star. My brain is not working. Sorry, it's very early in the morning.
It's
Still
brightened
on a
up though in
Sunday
your
morning.
background.
It has. It's the one at 26. Algol and Medusa.
Yeah.
I like playing around with the more feminist version of that myth than the original one we were taught in school.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of myths and in Jungian astrology and psychology, there's the shadow side that does come up when we talk about psychology. And when you are trained in any kind of counseling, you probably will run into that concept of projection or transference if you're a clinician. And if you study the Jungian, I think Kestrel, correct me if I'm wrong, that the shadow comes up quite often in Jungian psychology. And so when it comes to consulting, and when you're in the consulting room with somebody who's experiencing grief or trauma, we may be triggered and or activated. Sorry, use the
You're good.
I do that too, Laurie, still.
We all do
It's
it.
years and years of training.
So I think we should just talk about that a bit, when that shadow side comes up, or when we might potentially be seeing something of ourselves in the person, or we see that our client is projecting, right? It can be either way. So, what advice, or, what would you like to share when it comes to that as it comes up, and self-awareness, especially for the astrologer?
Kestrel, I'm keen to hear your response to this, actually.
Well, so as far as deep psychology and the shadow, and I've been thinking a lot about this because Alicia and I just did an internal family systems and astrology. I like to welcome the shadow, and I like to consider it an exile or an outcast, a part of ourselves that wasn't welcomed, or we were told we weren't enough, or we were too exuberant. It can also be a golden shadow too. It can also be a part that we want to welcome back. So I like to get curious and compassionate and clear about what that part of them is trying to express, and how it also might have wisdom for us. And there's probably a reason the shadow's there. What does it need? Because oftentimes if we ignore the shadow, it often doubles down or gets bigger. I don't know if folks on the call, if they've seen that Netflix series, or it's not a Netflix series, it's a Netflix documentary, Stutz. It's Jonah. It's a documentary on Jonah Hill's therapist. Yeah. And I don't want to give too many spoilers, but there's a time where Jonah's talking about his younger part, his shadow. It's labeled the shadow in there, and how his younger part was, fat and overwhelmed, and how present day Jonah was trying to ignore that. And the more that he ignored that part, the louder it got, and the more it wanted to be noticed. So that's one of the ways I like approaching the shadow. It's also like a way to be a little bit initiated too. It's asking for something.
Yeah. And I think we as astrologers can give really beautiful language to these, especially if we've got planets in instability of any kind, or in the hidden houses. What a big conversation I often have with clients is reclaiming Saturn. You know, especially if they're astrology students, everyone's scared of Saturn. It's bringing it back in. As someone with a very debilitated Saturn ruling my midheaven, you know, for me, it's very much about, okay, what is it about reclaiming this part of you or this piece of you, you know, and we can use the language of astrology here to help them see, you know. And I don't use debility or fall or anything with clients unless I know they know what I'm talking about. But I will say, you know, it's a part of you that may feel exiled, or a part of you that may feel really uncomfortable. And, you know, this part also has these resources and this part to play. So how can you bring this more into the light or help it feel more comfortable? What are some of the ways that you can support it here? And Laurie, you spoke to projection and transference, and there's countertransference as well. I don't see this as much in my astrological practice unless a client, you know, is activated in some way or has a lot going on. And so I think the best suggestion I can make here is us as consultants staying as neutral as possible, really, you know, being aware that that's their stuff, not ours. You know, I have had one or two clients kind of come at me in a way that tells me it's not about me, it's about their past experience with a certain person. And I won't necessarily name that, but I will say, oh, you know, I'm sorry that that came across in that way to you. Or, oh, I wasn't meaning that, I was meaning this, so I apologize. You know, so I often find, even if I didn't, you know, if apologizing or saying sorry can be a bridge. I find, especially in the astrological consultation, because it's part of me staying curious and hearing a client activated by something that I've said, even if I didn't mean it. I don't know if I'm explaining this properly, but I find that if I come from that position, and maybe it's my planets in Libra, it can be like helping a client come back away from the defensive position. That will often be where transference and projection are coming from, because they're just defenses. You know, defenses, we've obviously touched on something that is sore or painful. And so it's like, well, that's all about you. Or, oh my gosh, you remind me of my mother. You know, I'm just going to throw that, or that friend or whatever. Yeah. Does that help answer that question, Laurie? Kestrel, do you have more to add?
Go ahead, Lori. I don't know if I have more to add at the moment.
Yeah, I was just going to kind of like extend the question to the astrologers. So that, you know, what if it's the reverse? The astrologer may consciously or unconsciously be activated themselves. And, you know, how do you, I have some ideas, but I'm going to ask you first, like, how do you recognize that there's something being stirred in yourself, and kind of like ground that so that you can continue being the helper and not kind of derailed during the conversation?
Mm-hmm.
One of the biggest tips I have as a somatic therapist is to stay aware of your body.
Yeah.
Your body, you know, as Sylvain tells us, your body keeps the score. So if you can stay aware as much as possible, and I think this is the tricky thing with astrology, because it's so much about the head, but it's not. It's intuitive as much as it is data, and our intuition comes through our body. So staying really aware of any signals that are going on. Is your heart racing? Are you shallow breathing? Your stomach roiling, you know, and then going, okay, why? It might be a time to just say to a client, hey, I just need to think about this a little bit. That's what I say. Oh, that's really interesting. Let me think about this for a second. You know, you don't have to be up and on and in, you know, ready at all times. I find the pauses can be actually magical at times. And sometimes I just need to take a pause and just go, oh, okay, what's going on? Okay, you know, I use something called heart math, which is breathing in and out through your heart. It's a cool thing to look up. 4-7-8 breathing, you know, all these things, especially with your hand on your belly, you know, some polyvagal techniques, just to help me come back into my body if I'm feeling activated by a client's story. And I think doing the work, like regular journaling. We have to recognize that we as astrologers are similar to therapists in that way, that we don't want to bring our own biases, our own traumas, our own issues into the world, into the room. So we are as neutral and as clean slate as possible. We need to be regularly journaling, doing that emotional, mental health as much as physical health too, because it is a liminal space that we're dealing with clients in. We are clients in transitions and crossroads and pain. And when we're in that space, we need to be really aware of our own stuff that we're holding to, because it's so permeable, everything here. So yeah, that's my take on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the somatic experience is really important, and grounding into the breath, or even just like grounding both your feet on the ground or doing something tactile, slowing it down. I don't know if I've done this in an astrological consult, but sometimes I'll name what I'm feeling and just confirm or check with the client if they're experiencing it too. Because I think sometimes, well, I'm very watery and I have to be very clear about discerning where I end and another begins. So that's part of my work, that I'm always paying attention outside of consultations. And it's a parallel process. Like Alicia said, like we really need to be doing our work outside of the session and being mindful of what is getting activated for ourselves and getting some resolution with that if possible. But I think there can be a huge value in naming it. And oftentimes if I'm feeling it in the consult, I actually often don't think it's about me. I think I'm picking up on something in the ethers, and we'll just gently say, hey, I'm feeling this, or I'm noticing some tears scratching behind my eyes in what you're, sharing with me. And I honor that. Is that something that, are you experiencing that? And sometimes people will have it completely closed off. It's like it's in a blind spot, which then makes me curious what's in hidden houses. But sometimes then it allows people to feel the emotion that you're picking up on.
Yeah. I'd just like to add more of a story. I worked with children and their families, so that's my history. So I did a lot of group therapy because I was in schools, and I did a specific type of, it's an evidence-based practice, which I really enjoyed, because one of the things that we would do is we would say, when they had an activation, what happened, and we would run through the scenario. And one of the questions was always, well, what were your body cues? What was your body saying to you before the incident, happened? And the first time I would ask, it would always be nothing. I didn't have any. And then I'd say, well, did you feel anything in your tummy? Yeah. Did you clench your fist? Yeah. Did you feel hot in the face? Yeah. Did you yell? Yeah. Did you scream? You'd kind of go through these lists, and it was just amazing to watch these kids have these realizations. And then as they would work through the program, then the first time it was always nothing happened, I didn't have any. But by the end, they would be able to recognize them, and then they would be able to intervene earlier and not have, a more drastic kind of incident happening after. And that applies to adults. So, if you do have experiences in sessions, then that would be something to go through, like, where did I feel it, and kind of go through the different possibilities. And the more that you do that, the more aware you become, I think, in your body. And I know you have examples of much better programs than the one I'm talking about is designed for kids, but it's the concept.
Perfect. It's perfect. Like, I often, stuff is it's simple and it's to the point. In polyvagal theory, I've used this flip chart all the time, but they've got this cool one about, okay, what are you feeling like? Are you feeling like the playful puppy, the cat that's hissing, or the turtle in its shell, connected, fight, flight, freeze? It's really simple way of getting to people. So yeah, that's excellent, Laurie.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the more familiar we get with our own somatic experience, and we can name it to tame it, sort of, then we can really ask what we need. what calms and soothes that part of ourselves. And for our clients too, we can help them get really curious. And I know we're probably need to move on with time.
I think we're doing okay.
Are we? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I think we're going to kind of round up right on time. So we've talked about seeing difficult things in the charts, and so I guess the next question is more about the legal and the ethical considerations of even bringing those things up and in relation to grief and trauma. So is there something that you want to talk more about in that area, especially as it relates to our ethical and legal systems? And we're in different countries. I mean, I'm in Europe, Alicia, you're in Australia, Kestrel, you're in the US. And so, just to add that layer on, that we all need to be aware of our legal obligations, by state, by country, etc.
And also our ethical considerations as well, depending on which astrological organization we belong to, and all that kind of stuff is part of it as well. I think ethically, as astrologers, and legally too, legally we don't have as much as, like, for example, I do, or even you guys do, especially you've got more than me as licensed clinicians. But I think ethically, get really clear on your own ethics. Actually, that was be the first thing I'd say to any beginner astrologer, or anyone anywhere, even if you've been an astrologer for 20 years, re-examine your ethics. What are they? What's your moral code when it comes to dealing with clients? Also get really clear on what the standard is within the industry as well. ESA has an excellent ethical guidelines. IAEA is someone who's coming more to the fore around all of this too. They've got some ethical considerations on their website as well. What is the international? What does IAEA stand for again?
Oh, I don't remember.
International
Association
of Ethics in Astrology.
Ethical Astrology. Okay,
in
cool.
astrology, yeah.
Yeah. So that's something to be aware of and to follow. And I think you can register to their newsletters on their website as well. We have to be really careful as astrologers not to diagnose. And someone's just put, supervision, 100%. It's different to therapeutic supervision, but if you can find yourself a mentor that you're meeting with regularly, peers that you can talk to regularly as well. If you had a tricky consultation with someone, I have both supervision and astrological mentors too, that I can talk to about this stuff. Plus I have people like Kestrel and my wonderful water trio ladies as well, Cassandra and Kelly. So it's really important to feel connected, that networking Kestrel was talking about before, but don't feel like you have to sit and hold all this stuff on your own. Absolutely, there's confidentiality, but I always name to my clients, hey, I may discuss some of what we say without identifying features with my mentor. And I'm very careful about discussing clients, whether counseling or astrological clients, with others as well. I regularly don't. It might be a theme that I might bring up. I will never, ever let anyone know who my clients are. I think that's something really important as well. And having my own therapy. For me, it's just something I do. It's like I go and see the doctor regularly, or my naturopath. I also have my therapist, and my journaling practice, and my mindfulness practice, and all those kinds of things. So having a toolbox that supports you in that space is key.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, I would just reinforce all those things, and then just your own continuing education as well. Just really staying in touch with your own astrological practices, and boundaries as well. Everything around intimate relationships and money exchange, and also know when you're practicing out of the scope of your your capabilities, and
Mm.
it's okay to let clients know, I don't do this. And I have another astrologer who's way more versed in this area, or perhaps a therapist.
Yeah, good point. And I think it's something you brought up earlier, Kestrel, clients are our seventh house as well. So
Yes.
knowing your seventh house really well, how you are in intimate partnership will also help you understand, how you meet clients, and clients may meet you. So if you have a lot of water, or, whatever that looks like, do you need more boundaries? Or maybe you have Saturn there. Are you too boundaried?
Yeah. And we don't have to be, and I think it's also important to give ourselves permission. We don't have to be the right fit for everybody. And also, I know in my practice, when I get a query, I often have a little bit back and forth about what their hopes and expectations are, to also attune to, am I the best person to be giving this reading, or am I the best therapist for this person? And sometimes we'll offer that 10 to 15-minute consultation, because I want it to be win-win for everybody.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Kestrel. And I think another part to that piece too is, if you have a client who is attacking or a skeptic, or, you just don't feel comfortable in the consult, you can say, "Oh, I don't think I'm the right astrologer for you. I'm really happy to give you a refund or a half refund, whatever fits for you, and allow you to go and find another astrologer," because you don't have to keep yourself unsafe in the space too.
Correct.
Sometimes you will just come across those clients who are trying to disprove astrology, or, have something kind of weird and wonderful to be exploring. And if you're not comfortable with that, then, you don't have to.
Okay, wow, great discussion. I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. I think we'll go a little bit over our 90 minutes. Hopefully you can stay to answer any questions. Awesome.
Yeah.
So the question is about astrology today, and how we hear there's some statistics, not a lot, but there's definitely the statistics that astrology is growing. More and more people are coming to astrology. And so we could say that maybe there are some people that are seeking astrology in addition to therapy or in lieu of therapy. And so just curious what you think. I mean, you do both of you have clinical practices and astrology practices. So, why do you think more people are seeking out astrology, and do you see them choosing astrology over therapy, or, kind of like, what is your experience of this?
Well, I've been super interested by this. I discovered this psychologist, Scott Miller, who wrote an article, let me see if I can get it right. How did psychotherapy lose its magic? Did I get that right? I think that's the article. And I've actually consulted with Scott, and I'm totally forgetting the international organization he runs right now, so my apologies, but he's done a lot of exploring of evidence-based practices, and also looking at psychics and tarot readers and astrologers. And he's noted that there's been a decline in interest in therapy by 30%. And so he got really curious, what is that? And I'm really curious about it too, because I feel like bringing astrology into my practice has added so much more creativity and soulfulness, and meeting people in different belief systems. And the chart is so inclusive, including every area of the life. And I don't think that people are necessarily coming to therapists anymore just for a series of coping skills. I think people are wanting something deeper, more meaningful, acknowledging the mystery and the awe of the cosmos, and feeling a familiarity sometimes. I think as astrologers, we do actually, I know we're talking about this, but I think naturally we hold space and in a very eloquent way, and people feels very seen and very validated. I can't tell you how many times people walk away from my astrological consults just feeling like something was illuminated that we weren't getting to. in therapy. So I'll start there. There's more to say because I just think it's so juicy.
I agree with everything you're saying, Kestrel. You know, that awe, that wonder, that mystery, you know, it's like I did when I was doing my counseling degree or graduate diploma. I did a year of research, and I decided to research into spirituality in the counseling room because so few people used it. And I'd come through, you know, working from addiction treatment centers and 12-step programs and could see the benefits of just even having a higher power, what it did. And it was really interesting to kind of talk to clinicians who did use it, as how much more powerful it was. And I think this is where astrology treads that space. It treads that space between the numbers, the data, you know, where psychology sits, and the science of stuff. And it brings in the magic, you know, that all the belief, the faith, all those things that actually we really need when we want change. You know, we really need when we're in those darker places or those harder places. It's that kind of hope or possibility, you know. And I think this is where astrology brings, one of the things I really see, that it brings the gift of time to people, you know. And I think someone asked that question around grief and also trauma, you know, can we help people see that things will get easier with time? I think we need to be really careful about that because, you know, we don't want to push people past their process. But it is that sense of, oh, look, but you've got this Jupiter transit coming up, or, you know, Venus by progression is going to be doing this in your chart, you know, helping them see that there are other possibilities beyond where they are just now and what's going on at the moment. And I think as well, astrologers can offer really practical suggestions and possibilities that, you know, including ritual-based work that as a, you know, for me as a counselor, it's a bit different because I have a lot more leeway. But for, you know, as psychologists and you know, psychiatrists, they can't do that. You know, you have to be really careful about where you're guiding and the kind of container that you're working in to be licensed. So I think that's where astrology can really help. And just the fact that it's more accessible. You know, people will go to an astrologer before they'll go to a therapist. And I've actually had family members gift an astrological session from, you know, to a friend or a family member, hoping that they will then continue to see me as a therapist too. So it can be, and I know the same happens with you, Kestrel. It can be a gateway towards something else. And I think that's what astrologers can really hold, is that, you know, often clients are coming to us for personal development. So how can we help be a gateway towards what that looks like? And I think that's where resources can really help too.
Mhm.
Not resources, referrals.
Yeah. And it's really another layer of individualization that you cannot get from really any other, you know, type of helping field. You know, you actually see the Jupiter transits coming and the Saturn, and you can make sense of it when maybe when that person is looking around at other people in their lives and not understanding, like, well, why is this happening to me when, you know, others in the same, you know, situation, it looks different. And it's hard to make sense of that. But astrology cuts right through that and can say, well, you know, we're looking at you and your individual makeup, and it just has, I think, answers that you can't get from psychology or therapy alone.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
think that's why it's so wonderful when it gets coupled with other types of services. You know, there's many types of services now that I'm seeing combined. You know, we have someone I know who's in our attendees who does somatic experiencing, and we're actually going to do a webinar on that coming up in later in the fall. And I just think it's wonderful to start seeing how the different types of helping fields can combine, that, you know, you don't have to be in your vacuum, in your, you know, I only do this, but when we can embrace it, it makes what service you offer even better.
Yeah. the interdisciplinary nature of it. Yeah. 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 Well, and I'm seeing a lot of deep psychology show up in the chat too, with James Hillman and also Jung. And, I do know that criticism from Hillman about psychotherapy and just how it can be so reductive. And also, I love how Jung, and I've done this as well. I've experienced a client one-on-one, and finally, when I have permission to look at the chart, it highlights or illuminates something that was in a blind spot. And then the questions astrology asks are so different than how we're trained in evidence-based practices. So the breadth and depth, it's like, it's a different entry point into grief and trauma. Like, you can immediately go look at those Uranus transits for what individuation is happening in a certain area of the chart. You can go look at the dark houses and see what sort of placements and allies or challenges or exiles or whatever might be living in those places. It's kind of like creates a roadmap, right? But then finding the helpful language that doesn't scare clients, I think, is a part of the ethics too, that we bring it into terms or ask probing questions that still honors their agency and autonomy.
Yeah, my therapeutic supervisor, she says, I'm jealous of where astrology can help you go with clients, because she said, it may take me weeks of sessions, whereas you've just got this key to the lock in a way. But being careful. I mean, I have a story that a client has given me permission to share because she wants it known, but she went to see an astrologer when she was pregnant, and the astrologer warned her about miscarriage. And she ended up coming back to me. She's a regular client. I think it was a festival or a fair she went to, and she thought, oh, see an astrologer, and it's like, and actually I didn't even understand from the transits. I couldn't see where this miscarriage was. So I'm not sure what this astrologer was picking up on. But, it put so much stress on my client that it could have been a self-fulfilling prophecy in its own way. So we just have to be so careful about, I would never, ever, ever say that to a pregnant client, even if I saw something that could be like that. I'd just be saying, oh, yeah, are you getting lots of health checkups? Are you making sure all of that's going on? How often are you going to be seeing your midwife or whatever that looks like? But yeah, we do need to be so careful about how we talk to clients and what we name with those transits or placements as well. So having a breadth of language around how you speak, especially to debility in a client's chart, as if you're a traditional astrologer especially, is really key.
Yeah.
That could be a whole other webinar.
Right. Yes. Yes, I agree. Okay, well, are you ready to take some questions? All righty, we have a few in the Q&A box. Let's see, the first one, it says, how do you correlate experiences with grief and trauma in the 6th, 8th, and 12th houses? And I think maybe the question could be reframed as, do you correlate that? And yeah, I'll go ahead and let you answer that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was going through a 12th house perfection year when my father died. I also had Jupiter in the 12th. So I will say that with some of the languaging that I use with clients is, hey, you've got, an 8th house year coming up. You may be looking at worries or fears, or, it may be, or potentially grief could be coming up if it's a 12th house transit. I won't say exactly what they may be grieving, but it's within the language that I use when I'm talking about those houses. I don't so much with the 6th, though. I mean, it is a hidden house, but I don't know. It just doesn't feel like grief is as connected to it for me. What about you, Kestrel?
I don't know if I tune into the 6th around that. I do look to the 4th, though, for some of the ancestral grief. And I guess I just have been wanting to say this whole time, I want to broaden grief beyond just the loss of another person. And I think as astrologers looking to the the 4th, the 6th, the 8th, and the 12th, we can also look at parts of ourselves that we want, like the exiles that want to be retrieved or reclaimed and welcome back.
When you say
Yeah.
exiles, you mean fall?
Yeah, the exile is coming from internal family systems. My apologies for that. But yeah, I think it is good to notice what, if you do have planets in fall in those houses, not everybody will, but yeah, I think the 8th house really brings up grief and mental health as well. It's not just the 12th house. And I love the questions of the 12th of, it's the place of our undoing, but it's also of our undoing can be an unraveling and an unpacking and a better understanding of ourselves as well. And trying to find language to talk about it more empowering as well. Mm-hmm. Does that answer the question they asked? I think I got a little tangential and sidetracked.
I think that you not only answered that one, but there was a second question in here that you covered as well. There were 2 questions about the 8th and the 12th houses. Thank you.
Yeah.
There's a question about IFS and astrology class. That must be something that you spoke of earlier. So, Camille would like to know when, where was the IFS astrology class, and is that available somewhere?
Is that all right for us to promote, Laurie? It's something that we did.
Yeah. Yes, please share with what the 2 of you did. Yeah.
So it has been held already, but you can go to my website, aliciayusuf.com. It is available for immediate download. And we have had interest in a continuing thing with it. So if you follow actually, Kestrel, do you have a newsletter list?
I don't.
No. So sign up to my newsletter. Good. Sign up to my newsletter. And we're potentially doing either a series of workshops or a full day workshop or something around this. We're just about to talk about that. So
Wonderful.
And just for those that don't know, IFS is internal family systems, and it's a fantastic, it's in one of our resources, No Bad Parts by Richard Schwartz. It's a great way to help clients talk about pain and grief and trauma and exiles and all that kind of stuff, shadow work.
Okay. And Lori just popped in the Alicia's website. So if you are interested in that, you can grab that link from the chat box. Okay, so let's see. Martha asks, how do you partition your counseling practice from your astrology practice?
Part of that for me is just how to make a living. So I don't know if Kepler probably offers courses around how to think about pricing. And I just get a lot more clinical clients that come to me. And I also think part of it is just the preparation time with the chart. I tend to see like 2 to 5 astrology clients a week, and then the other 15 to 20 clients that's a lot, by the way. Like I just want to like reflect. I think if you're in private practice and you're seeing therapeutic clients, you can 15 to 20 is reasonable. I think it's a lot harder to see that number astrologically. And I accept insurance too. So I just get a lot of referrals that way. But I do a lot of astrology on the side. And I also have a podcast, although we haven't been that active around it, just because the creativity of it makes it so much more fun.
Sure. I'd say what Kestrel says, and I'm very, very clear, especially if a client has seen me for an astrological consult, when they come to me for a counseling consult, I have a whole different opening, talk to them about how much more reflective I am, how much more sad I will be, how much more I'll be listening. If they're used to me being, talking most of the time, it's really different. And I talk to them about, some of the frameworks that I use, and the fact that, for example, confidentiality and privacy looks different for an astrological client as a counselling. For example, here in Australia, I'm a mandatory reporter, which doesn't apply to astrology, that harm to self or harm to others. So that would be my addition.
Thank you. And if anyone is having trouble finding the IFS, Chloe just popped into the chat box a link, so definitely go check that out. Okay, question about, do you feel that people can get stuck in grief, and how would you handle that without pushing?
Good question. I don't know that I would do that as an astrologer. I would be referring for sure. And naming that, I would say, but it's really, it's a hard one to know without, what does stuck grief look like, because for one person, if they've lost someone 10 years ago, but it was someone pivotal to their life, then yes, they may still have grief coming up on a regular basis, especially with anniversaries. So if they are naming that it's affecting their life and they feel like it's holding them back, then I would be discussing potentially as an astrologer what it is that they are avoiding potentially by going into the grief. Generally, I think I would be referring, because there's a complexity come with grief, depending on past grief experiences, past trauma, all that kind of stuff that you as an astrologer may not be able to hold space for or recognize what's going on just due to training. I'm sure intuitively people could do it, but yeah, it would be my suggestion. Kestrel, what would you add, lovely?
Yeah, I'd be very mindful about it as well, just because it's easy to judge. And I think that each case of grief is so unique. And it's not always something to get over. It's something to integrate. And I think we're forever changed and transformed in very different ways by the experience. So I think it's easier. I find myself pulling into my therapy role. But yeah, I think everything you said was really legitimate. But I do think people feel a lot of isolation and grief, or sometimes avoid the grief that might create some of the stuckness that one might perceive.
Yeah.
Okay, we have two more questions, and they're more astrology related. So the first one is about Chiron. Do you look at Chiron as the wounding in the seventh? And this particular one is about the seventh house, but I think maybe just, Chiron in general. Would you look to that for finding grief and trauma?
I'll let Kestrel answer this, because I no longer work with Chiron psychologically. I work with it in medical. Yeah, I'm a Kestrel
Okay.
answer.
Oh, that's good to know. Yeah. No, I definitely look to Chiron for grief. I mean, it doesn't always show up, or grief or trauma, because I think there's so much wisdom in that archetype, and speaking to people about their experiences. Just more specifically, I would probably just ask probing questions about that placement if it seemed relevant to the reading, just to try to keep it concise. I hope that's helpful.
Great. And then the last question is, do you use, what house system do you use? And do you look at two different ones to kind of like get a bigger picture?
I was trained in Placidus, but I am a traditional astrologer now. So I am a whole house girl, although I do for medical astrology use Regiomontanus. So if I will often have a quick peek in solar returns at Regiomontanus, and if I see something going on there, then yes, I will flip back and forth, especially 6th house, 12th house. I do see a correlation there between kind of physical and mental or emotional health going on. So that might be where I would, probably the only time I would really bring in a different house system. What about you, Kestrel?
I always like to toggle between whole and Placidus. I traditionally work with whole sign, but I think it's always worth a little peek just to see how that changes the chart. Like in my chart, it changes it very slightly. And so it's curious to think about the placement that moves from the 12th to the 11th in my particular chart and just try on the ideas. But it's not always going to be the case for everybody. And I know Kate Petty really likes using, is it quadrant houses? But I just think it's always worth taking a look. Yeah.
If you
you
know
can
it.
see it. Yeah. If you know it. Yeah. Because it shows,
Yeah.
it might reflect something else.
Yeah. But also don't overcomplicate it too. Don't feel like you have to add it to your practice to get juice. Yeah.
No, keep it simple. Sometimes you're already going to be showing up with so much information. I think that's something we have to be mindful as well, is what we have to offer and what we have to bring is probably more than our clients can even absorb in one consultation. So
100%.
just a friendly reminder.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
We
And
see so much.
Right. I always find that they have more information than I can share, but I like to have it because, it's there, but we, knowing that when we come in, we're only going to be able to talk about an hour or 90 minutes worth of material. And just so I answer the question too, I use whole house system, but I will look at Placidus just to see if it significantly changes, because some people like Kestrel, it doesn't change very much. And then some like mine changes significantly, like when you have a later degree of an ascendant, so just knowing that the two charts can have a significant shift in house systems can inform you in the session that if it seems like they're not relating as much, that maybe that other house system might have more material for you. But I have found that it's very difficult to go into a session and toggle between two house systems with a client. So it's more, I think, for you, just in preparation and having some understanding of just knowing that there could be significant differences or minimal differences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also just wanted to say to everyone before we close up today, the topics we have been talking about are potentially activating. So, if anyone needs to reach out to either Kestrel or myself, please do. And just take care of yourself, because all of us have some kind of grief story. Many of us have some kind of trauma story. So, and we're just after a rather intense Scorpio eclipse, South Node eclipse. So, yeah, just take care of yourself. I can see people in the chats sharing their stories, and I really appreciate all the chat, all the talk. It's been wonderful. And I'd also say look after yourselves too.
All right. Thank you. Kestrel, do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share?
No, I'm just so honored to be here and to be able to share and to witness. So thank you for having me, Lori.
Yeah.
It's my
Thank you,
pleasure.
Lori. Thank you, Kepler.
Yeah, I'm really happy that we could do this. I'm, personally very happy to host the two of you and to bring this topic up that I think is not as talked about as, obviously technique in astrology is what we usually are presenting. And so I'm really happy that we could contribute this to the content that is out there, and this will get posted on our YouTube channel as a replay. So you can definitely watch it again. You can let others know if you think that this will be helpful, that it will be available to the entire community. So thank you so much for being here, and we will see you in the next webinar. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.